An alarming number of the world's children are living in conflict regions amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Israel's counteroffensive against the Palestinian militant group Hamas in Gaza. So what do the latest statistics tell us about the shocking plight of children in conflict regions? Why are children in Gaza facing the brutal brunt of armed conflict between Israel and Hamas? And what is being done to ease the sufferings of these children? Hello and welcome. You're watching Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we address the plight of children in conflict regions. And for more on their painful reality, I have the chairman of Save the Children Korea here in the studio. Mr. Joon, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
I also have Kwon Soa. Soa, welcome back.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
All right then, Mr. Let's start off with your thoughts on the brutal impact of armed conflict on children.
I think we need to look at this issue with an understanding that the nature of warfare has changed dramatically over the last century. In the First World War, 70% of those who got killed were soldiers, whereas during the Second World War, over 70% were civilians. So that means that, with the development of weapons, which became more destructive, more indiscriminate, more and more civilians are getting killed. According to a certain research, by the end of the 20th century, over 90% of all the casualties from the wars and armed conflict were civilians. So the United Nations got very alarmed about this situation. And as you know, among civilians, children are particularly vulnerable. Children and women, of course, are particularly vulnerable. And the United Nations, since 1996, has maintained a special representative on children and armed conflict. And the UN also has defined six most grave violations against children during conflicts, which include killing and maiming of children, abduction of children, sexual violence against children, and recruitment of children as child soldiers, and also attack on schools and hospitals, as well as denial of humanitarian access.
Right. Mr. Your organization also says that 1 out of 6 children in the world live in a conflict region. Could you tell us a bit more about the statistics involving children amid warfare?
Actually, by now, it's 1 out of 5 children, because the recent wars in Ukraine and Gaza are making things worse. It was 1 out of 5, now it was 1 out of 6, but now it's 1 out of 5 children in the world live in the conflict regions or areas that are seriously affected by wars and conflicts. And in Gaza alone, almost 12,000 children have been killed during the last 4 months, which is a terrible number because that is almost 4 times as large as annual number of children getting killed in conflicts. There is a reason, of course, because in Gaza, which is a very densely populated region, and you really cannot tell civilian parts and battlefield. There's no battlefield. The battle is taking place everywhere, which makes things worse.
Right, of course. And staying with the children in Gaza for some more perspective, Soa, could you tell us a bit more about the sufferings of the young there?
It is devastating and heartbreaking to see the media coverage related to Gaza children. These 2 words typed into search engines are nothing like what you would get when you put in Seoul children or Berlin children, because you would get things like the best things to do with kids in Seoul or top 10 attractions for children in Berlin, for instance. But what you get in relation to children in Gaza is 10,000 children killed in nearly 100 days of war. almost 10% of Gaza's under fives now acutely malnourished. More than 10 children losing legs in Gaza every day. So getting into the details of some of the sufferings reported about. According to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, more than 10,000 children, which is 1% of Gaza's child population, has been killed since October 7th, in around 100 days since the outbreak of the crisis. That number itself is shocking enough, but as the New York Times pointed out in late November, is that the death toll of women and children in Gaza in less than 2 months into the war was twice as high as that in Ukraine in almost 2 years since Russia's invasion. So the fast rise in the death toll is being pointed out here. And conflict casualty experts were said to have been taken aback at how rapidly women and children are becoming victims in this war. When it comes to injuries, children's bodies are much more vulnerable to them. CNN coverage cited figures that said more than 10 children on average a day have either lost one or both of their legs in the Gaza Strip since October 7th. Many amputations are being performed without anesthesia due to the shortage in medical supplies, unbearable even for experienced professionals to see the children in pain. Another issue, food shortage. Save the Children in a press release had said 335,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of severe malnutrition or starvation, and all of the 1 million children in Gaza have not enough to eat. Wall Street Journal looked into women going into labor under the worst circumstances, some of them having to give birth at makeshift tents, overcrowded shelters, and public bathrooms with not enough operating hospitals left. And lack of pre- and postnatal care leaves mothers as well as the babies in danger.
Right, and staying with the shocking sufferings of children in Gaza, according to your organization, Save the Children, Mr. O, data shows that the number of children reported killed in Gaza in just 3 weeks, and I quote, surpassed the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones since 2019. What makes the children in Gaza so much more vulnerable to the brutal conflict there?
Well, as I said earlier, with the weapons developments, now we have technology, the killing technology like missiles, air bombing, all of these very destructive and indiscriminate weapons. If you recall that when they first started to use machine guns during the American Civil War, there were a lot of debates that we should ban the use of machine guns because machine guns are so indiscriminate and destructive compared to ordinary rifles. When you think back on that, it's almost ridiculous that machine guns are indiscriminate compared to missiles and air bombing and other artillery, these terrible weapons. So with that, you cannot really tell civilians from soldiers. I don't know how many soldiers are there in Gaza, but they are mostly hidden. The irony is that soldiers are better protected because not only in Gaza but in any other war zones, soldiers are in bunkers, soldiers are protected by armors, but civilians are not, children are not. So that's a problem. And also, as I said, Gaza is a very densely populated area. And the population, Palestinian population in Gaza and in West Bank, they live off humanitarian assistance provided by the international community. And with this conflict, with these battles going on, there is no humanitarian assistance arriving. Actually, the total delivery of aid from the outside world is less than half of ordinarily what they ordinarily get, which is terrible because, as Soa said, it necessarily leads to food insecurity, and they don't have much of a service, whether it's medical, school. So for children, it's a terrible situation.
Right, indeed. And beyond the Middle East, Soa, over in Europe, Ukraine claims that 19,000 children, over 19,000 children, were illegally taken by Russia since its invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022. Now, recent articles have covered this particular claim, I believe. Could you tell us a bit more about this coverage?
Right. The Ukrainian government estimates now that at least 19,500 Ukrainian children have been illegally deported or forcibly displaced to Russia and Russian-occupied territory in the past 2 years. But that's just the documented or verified number, with authorities worrying the abductions could actually be in the 100,000s. Only 388 of these children have been able to return home as of recent data, and it's these kids' testimonies that help getting a picture of what's going on. They, among which some have grown into young adults now, told media, NGOs, as well as U.S. Congress how their families were separated under the circumstances of the war and how they, the kids, were abducted amidst that chaos. Children were taken to Russian foster families or so-called summer camps. Russian families are being encouraged by the government and law to even adopt Ukrainian children that were deported in illegal manner, while according to international law, raising and educating children of war in a foreign nation can be seen as an act of genocide. In fact, Ukrainian minors told stories of how Russian authorities replaced their citizenship and tried to brainwash them, for example, by portraying Ukrainians as Nazis and fascists, and much of that having happened at those camps that I mentioned earlier. So that Russification also being evident in a number of young Ukrainians actually having hesitated to come back, to return to their country.
Right, I see. Mr. Are there no tangible, perhaps, international legal frameworks to better protect children in conflict-ridden regions?
There are legal frameworks, of course. As I pointed out earlier, the United Nations has maintained a special representative on children and armed conflicts since 1996, so it's almost 30 years. And earlier than that, in 1989, they agreed on a human rights convention called Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, which has a provision for children in armed conflicts and war. CRC also has an optional protocol meaning additional treaty that countries can choose to adopt, and optional protocol on children and armed conflicts is open to all UN member states, which has more detailed provisions for children involved in hostilities or conflicts. And in addition to that, we have what is called international humanitarian law, which mostly consists of Geneva Conventions. There are a series of Geneva Conventions. Some people call them rules for warfare. And so even during a war or conflict, armed conflict, you should treat children specially. You cannot just involve children in, for example, in recruitments by armed forces or groups. You cannot torture children. You cannot sexually violate children. So there are special provisions for children in international law and international legal framework, as you mentioned. But the question is whether all these laws and regulations are observed and respected by countries which are, parties to conflict, parties to a war. Because when you are fighting, countries are so desperate, so they seem to employ whatever tools they have without regard for these international law and humanitarian law.
And given that dismal reality, Mr. What is your organization, Save the Children, doing perhaps to ease the plight of children in such environments?
Well, Save the Children has recently came up with a plan to strengthen our activities in the area of humanitarian assistance, not least given the recent conflict and children who are suffering there. So we came up with a plan to cover 16 million children over 40 countries, in over 40 countries who are either in conflict or affected by conflicts. And for that, we have a plan to raise funds in the amount of 1.3 billion US dollars. And we hope our plan will pan out, and we hope we will be able to deliver more children from these conundrums, and not just to save the children, but I think other international bodies and organizations concerning children, including UNICEF, a UN body, all of us are strengthening, redoubling our efforts.
Right. And so despite the current common belief that Ukraine and Gaza are perhaps the most horrible places for children in conflict to be living in, I understand that on the list of the top 10 worst countries to be in as children, these two countries are not on that particular list.
Right, that's the worst conflict-affected countries for minors to live in based on data from 2022, which, however, separately states that the number of children killed in Gaza has surpassed the annual death toll of the children killed in conflict zones since 2019, as we earlier mentioned before. But if we take a look at the ranking by Save the Children, Afghanistan, as of latest, is assessed as the most dangerous country to live in for minors, followed by Congo, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. So we can notice how most of these countries are in the African continent or in Asia or, geopolitically speaking, Middle East. Children in these countries are suffering from extreme hunger, lack of education, violence, war, and natural disasters. Going into some of the details of the three countries in the top, according to Save the Children, in Afghanistan, it's a severe economic crisis and worst drought in 3 decades that leaves children in hunger and disease. And following the Taliban's ban on female aid workers, it has become extremely difficult to provide humanitarian assistance. Children in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where conflicts are continuing for around 30 years, are experiencing violations against their rights every day. Infant mortality is among the highest in the world, especially due to low vaccination rates. The longer than 10 years of violence in Syria has led to half of the country's kids growing up knowing nothing but conflict, is how Save the Children explains the situation there. Children are in psychological distress due to separation from families because of death, detainment, or disappearance. Last year's devastating earthquakes have added to the crisis. And what needs to be considered is that some of the conflicts are in the headlines every day, others are not. And much of that has got to do because some of the conflicts have been continuing for decades already. So we are still seeing many, many countries where these children are suffering, just like in Gaza right now.
Right, and keeping in mind this disturbing data as shared by Soa from your agency, Save the Children, Mr. what more can be done to raise greater awareness about the sufferings of children in the top 10 countries?
Well, as Soa pointed out, some of these issues, some of these conflicts have been going on for many, many years, even for decades. So by now, I think sometimes we are so used to the stories, so we are not alerted enough, even if things get worse in those conflict countries. And so keeping our attention and raising our awareness on these problems is extremely important. We of course, the media also plays a lot of role in that, but I think all of us need to pay attention to these problems because they are happening in our world, So we share the earth, share our planet with all of them, and that is taking place right now. So I think all of us need to, individually in any country, we need to, talk to our policymakers, talk to our political leaders about the need to pay more attention to these problems taking place all over the world. If we are close-minded and we don't care about it, we only care about our own economy, care about our own problems, and don't care anything about what is happening out there, then I think eventually when these children grow up, children in conflict areas, when they grow up without proper education, without proper nourishment, I think that will add to the problems, global problems we have right now. So that's why we need more awareness on these issues.
And collective action, of course.
That's true, very true.
So how can ordinary people then do their part to perhaps tackle this crisis faced by children in conflict regions?
Well, I think, as I said, they can always have their political leadership to give their feedback. And, especially in democracies, we elect our leaders, so we listen to our leaders talking about these problems. When it comes to election, we pay more attention to the candidates who have awareness, and at the same time, we can also support these international, organizations and non-governmental organizations as well. As I said, UNICEF and Save the Children is not the only NGO supporting children, so there are other NGOs as well. So whichever organization you decide to support, you can support by donation, you can support by volunteering, what is important is, maintaining your attention to these problems as they are taking place in our world.
Right, keeping an interest in these very severe issues and making sure you don't become inert to them despite how long they take.
Very true, yeah.
All right, Mr. O, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And so, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you, Sunny.
Right, well, on that note, we end this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend. See you same time next Monday.